Well, hello. Welcome back to The People's Historian. I am Jason Kishinev. Each episode, we read about 30 minutes out of a history book. We are reading chapter 22 of A People's History of the United States. And before we dig in, would you do me a favor and hit that like and subscribe button for me? Maybe hit that notification bell. And then you'll be notified each time I make a new video, because YouTube has been known to unsubscribe people from time to time. Shall we? The repeated elections of Republican candidates, Reagan in 1980 and 1984, George Bush in 1988, were treated by the press with words like landslide and overwhelming victory. They were ignoring four facts: that roughly half the population, although eligible to vote, did not; that those who did vote were limited severely in their choices to the two parties that monopolized the money and the media; that as a result, many of their votes were cast without enthusiasm; and that there was little relationship between voting for a candidate and voting for specific policies. In 1980, Reagan received 51.6% of the popular vote, while Jimmy Carter received 41.7%, and John Anderson, a liberal Republican running on a third-party ticket, yes, that's right, a liberal Republican, received 6.7%. Only 54% of the voting age population voted, so that of the total eligible to vote, 27% voted for Reagan. A survey by the New York Times found that only 11% of those who voted for Reagan did so because he's a real conservative. 3 times as many said they voted for him because it's time for a change. For a second term, running against former Vice President Walter Mondale, Jimmy Carter's vice president, Reagan won 59% of the popular vote, but with half the electorate not voting, he had 29% of the voting population. In the 1988 election, with Vice President George Bush running against Democrat Michael Dukakis, Bush's 54% victory added up to 27% of the eligible voters. Because our peculiar voting arrangements allow a small margin of popular votes to become a huge majority of electoral votes, the media can talk about overwhelming victory, thus deceiving their readers and disheartening those who don't look closely at the statistics. Could one say from these figures that the American people wanted Reagan or Bush as president? One could certainly say that more voters preferred the Republican candidates to their opponents, but even more seemed to want neither candidate. Nevertheless, on the basis of these slim electoral pluralities, Reagan and Bush would claim that the people had spoken. Indeed, when the people did speak about issues in surveys of public opinion, they expressed beliefs to which neither the Republican nor Democratic parties paid attention. For instance, both parties, through the 80s and early 90s, kept strict limits on social programs for the poor, on the grounds that this would require more taxes, and the people did not want higher taxes. You see what I say I like that? The people. That's because it's in quotations, and I don't want to keep doing this, because I think that looks silly to do that too much. Too much. Use air quotes. This was certainly true as a general proposition, that Americans wanted to pay as little in taxes as possible, but when they were asked if they would be willing to pay higher taxes for specific purposes, like health and education, they said yes, they would. For instance, a 1990 poll of Boston area voters showed that 54% of them would pay more taxes if that would go toward cleaning up the environment. Go Boston. And when higher taxes were presented in class terms, rather than as a general proposal, people were quite clear. A Wall Street Journal NBC News poll in December 1990 showed that 84% of the respondents favored a surtax on millionaires. This provision was dropped around that time from a Democratic-Republican budget compromise. Even though 51% of the respondents were in favor of raising the capital gains tax, neither major party favored that. A Harvard School of Public Health poll of 1989 showed that most Americans, 61%, favored a Canadian-type health system in which the government was the single payer to doctors and hospitals, bypassing the insurance companies and offering universal medical coverage to everyone. Neither the Democratic nor the Republican Party adopted that as its program, although both insisted they wanted to reform the health system. To this day, I do not believe either party has ever added that universal health care single payer to their platform, but I could be wrong. I don't believe that the Democrats ever did. A survey by the Gordon Black Corporation for the National Press Club in 1992 found that 59% of all voters wanted a 50% cut in defense spending in 5 years. Neither of the major parties was willing to make major cuts in the military budget. 59% of all voters in 92 wanted a 50% cut. Nice. How the public felt about government aid to the poor seemed to depend on how the question was put. Both parties and the media talked incessantly about the welfare system, that it was not working, and the word welfare became a signal for opposition. When people were asked, a New York Times CBS News poll of 1992, if more money should be allocated to welfare, 23% said no. But when the same people were asked, should the government help the poor, 64% said yes. This was a recurring theme. When at the height of the Reagan presidency in 1987, people were asked if the government should guarantee food and shelter to needy people, 62% answered yes. Clearly there was something amiss with the political system supposed to be democratic, in which the desires of the voters were repeatedly ignored. They could be ignored with impunity, so long as the political system was dominated by two parties, both tied to corporate wealth. An electorate forced to choose between Carter and Reagan, or Reagan and Mondale, or Bush and Dukakis, could only despair or decide not to vote, because neither candidate was capable of dealing with the fundamental economic illness whose roots were deeper than any single presidency. That illness came from a fact which was almost never talked about, that the United States was a class society in which 1% of the population owned 33% of the wealth, with an underclass of 30 to 40 million people living in poverty. The social programs of the 60s, Medicare and Medicaid, food stamps, etc., did not do much more than maintain the historic American maldistribution of resources. While the Democrats would give more help to the poor than the Republicans, they were not capable, indeed not really desirous, of seriously tampering with an economic system in which corporate profit comes before human need. There was no important national movement for radical change, no social democratic or democratic socialist party such as existed in countries in Western Europe, Canada, New Zealand. But there were 1,000 signs of alienation, voices of protest, local actions in every part of the country to call attention to deep-felt grievances, to demand that some injustice be remedied. For instance, the Citizens Clearinghouse for Hazardous Wastes in Washington, D.C., which had formed early in the Reagan administration by housewife and activist Lois Gibbs, reported that it was giving help to 8,000 local groups around the country. One of these groups in Oregon brought a series of successful lawsuits to force the Environmental Protection Agency to do something about unsafe drinking water in the Bull Run Reservoir near Portland. In Seabrook, New Hampshire, there were years of persistent protest around a nuclear power plant which residents considered a danger to themselves and their families. Between 1977 and 1989, over 3,500 people were arrested in these protests. Ultimately, the plant, plagued by financial problems and opposition, had to shut down. Fear of nuclear accidents was intensified by disastrous events at 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania in 1979, and by an especially frightening calamity in Chernobyl in the Soviet Union in 1986. All of this was having an effect on the once booming nuclear industry. By 1994, the Tennessee Valley Authority had stopped the construction of 3 nuclear plants, which the New York Times called the symbolic death notice for the current generation of reactors in the United States. In Minneapolis, Minnesota, thousands of people demonstrated year after year against the Honeywell Corporation's military contracts, and between 1982 and 1988, over 1,800 people were arrested. Furthermore, when those who engaged in such civil disobedience were brought into court, they often found sympathetic support from juries, winning acquittals from ordinary citizens who seemed to understand that even if they had technically broken the law, they had done so in a good cause. In 1984, a group of Vermont citizens, the Winooski 44, refused to leave the hallway outside a U.S. Senator's office, protesting his votes to give arms to the Nicaraguan Contras. They were arrested, but at their trial they were treated sympathetically by the judge and acquitted by the jury. And no, it's not Bernie Sanders in 1984. At another trial shortly after, a number of people, including activist Abby Hoffman and Amy Carter, the daughter of former President Jimmy Carter, were charged with blocking CIA recruiters at the University of Massachusetts. They called to the witness stand ex-CIA agents who told the jury that the CIA had engaged in illegal and murderous activities all around the world. The jury acquitted them. One juror, a woman hospital worker, said later, "I was not familiar with the CIA's activities. I was shocked. I was kind of proud of the students." Another juror said, "It was very educational." The county district attorney prosecuting the case concluded if there is a message, it was that this jury was composed of Middle America. Middle America doesn't want the CIA doing what they are doing. In the South, while there was no great movement comparable to the civil rights movement of the 60s, there were hundreds of local groups organizing poor people, white and black. In North Carolina, Linda Stout, the daughter of a mill worker who had died of industrial poisons, coordinated a multiracial network of 500 textile workers, farmers, maids, most of them low-income women of color, in the Piedmont Peace Project. The historic Highlander Folk School in Tennessee, which had nurtured so many black and white activists throughout the South, was now joined by other folk schools and popular education centers. Anne Braden, a veteran of racial and labor struggles in the South, was still organizing, leading the Southern Organizing Committee for Economic and Social Justice. The group gave help in local actions to 300 African Americans in Tift County, Georgia, who were protesting the existence of a chemical plant which was making them sick, to Native Americans in Cherokee County, North Carolina, who were organizing to stop a polluted landfill. Back in the 60s, Chicano farm workers, people of Mexican descent who came to work and live mostly in California and the southwestern states, rebelled against their feudal working conditions. They went out on strike and organized a national boycott of grapes under the leadership of Cesar Chavez. Soon, farm workers were organizing in other parts of the country. In the 70s and 80s, their struggles against poverty and discrimination continued. The Reagan years hit them hard, as it did poor people all over the country. By 1984, 42% of all Latino children and 1/4 of the families... What? By 1984, 42% of all Latino children and 1/4 of the families lived below the poverty line. Copper miners in Arizona, mostly Mexican, went on strike against the Phelps Dodge Company after it cut wages, benefits, and safety measures in 1983. They were attacked by National Guardsmen and state troopers, by tear gas and helicopters, but held out for 3 years until a combination of governmental and corporate power finally defeated them. There were victories, too. In 1985, 1,700 cannery workers, most of them Mexican women, went on strike in Watsonville, California, and won a union contract with medical benefits. Excuse me. In 1990, workers who had been laid off from the Levi Strauss Company in San Antonio because the company was moving to Costa Rica called a boycott, organized a hunger strike, and won concessions. In Los Angeles, Latino janitors went on strike in 1990, and despite police attacks, won recognition of their union, a pay raise, and sick benefits. Latino and Latina activists, not necessarily Chicano, which refers to those of Mexican ancestry, through the 80s and early 90s campaigned for better labor conditions, for representation in local government, for tenants' rights, and for bilingual education in the schools. Kept out of the media, they organized a bilingual radio movement, and by 1991 had 14 Latino stations in the country, 12 of them bilingual. In New Mexico, Latinos fought for land and water rights against real estate developers who tried to throw them off land they had lived on for decades. In 1988, there was a confrontation, and the people organized an armed occupation, built bunkers for protection against attack, and won support from other communities in the Southwest. Finally, a court ruled in their favor. Abnormal rates of cancer for farm workers in California aroused the Chicano community. Cesar Chavez of the United Farm Workers fasted for 35 days in 1988 to call attention to these conditions. There were now United Farm Workers unions in Texas, Arizona, and other states. The importation of Mexican workers for low wages under terrible conditions spread from the Southwest to other parts of the country. By 1991, 80,000 Latinos lived in North Carolina, 30,000 in North Georgia. The Farm Labor Organizing Committee, which had won a difficult strike in the Ohio tomato fields in 1979, the largest agricultural strike ever in the Midwest, brought thousands of farm workers together in several Midwest states. As the Latino population of the country kept growing, it soon matched the 12% of the population that was African American and begun to have a distinct effect on American culture. Much of its music, art, and drama was much more consciously political and satirical than mainstream culture. The Border Arts Workshop was formed in 1984 by artists and writers in San Diego and Tijuana, and its work dealt powerfully with issues of racism and injustice. In Northern California, Teatro Campesino and Teatro de la Esperanza performed for working people all over the country, turning schoolhouses, churches, and fields into theaters. Latinos were especially conscious of the imperial role the United States had played in Mexico and the Caribbean, and many of them became militant critics of U.S. policy toward Nicaragua, El Salvador, and Cuba. In 1970, a great march in Los Angeles against the Vietnam War, which had been attacked by police, left 3 Chicanos dead. When the Bush administration, the George H.W. Bush administration, Bush Sr., the one that just passed away, when the Bush administration was preparing for war against Iraq in the summer of 1990, thousands of people in Los Angeles marched along the same route they had taken 20 years before when they were protesting the Vietnam War. As Elizabeth Martinez wrote, before and during President Bush's war in the Persian Gulf, many people, including raza, literally race, a term adopted by Latino activists, had doubts about it or were opposed. We had learned some lessons about wars started in the name of democracy that turned out to benefit only the rich and powerful. Raza mobilized to protest this war of mass murder, even faster than the U.S. war in Vietnam, though we could not stop it. In 1992, a fundraising group which came out of the Vietnam War called Resist made donations to 168 organizations around the country, community groups, peace groups, Native American groups, prisoners' rights organizations, health and environmental groups. A new generation of lawyers, schooled in the 60s, constituted a small but socially conscious minority within the legal profession. They were in court defending the poor and the helpless, or bringing suit against powerful corporations. One law firm used its talent and energy to defend whistleblowers, men and women who were fired because they blew the whistle on corporate corruption that victimized the public. The women's movement, which had managed to raise the consciousness of the whole nation on the issue of sexual equality, faced a powerful backlash in the 80s. The Supreme Court's defense of abortion rights in its 1973 Roe v. Wade decision aroused a pro-life movement that had strong supporters in Washington. Congress passed, and the Supreme Court later let stand, a law that eliminated federal medical benefits to help poor women pay for abortions. But the National Organization of Women and other groups remained strong. In 1989, a Washington rally for what had come to be known as the right to choose drew over 300,000 people. When in 1994 and 1995, abortion clinics were attacked and several supporters murdered, the conflict became grimly intense. The rights of gay and lesbian Americans had come vividly to the forefront in the 70s with radical changes and ideas about sexuality and freedom. The gay movement then became a visible presence in the nation with parades, demonstrations, campaigns for the elimination of state statutes discriminating against homosexuals. One result was a growing literature about the hidden history of gay life in the United States and in Europe. In 1994, there was a Stonewall 25 march in Manhattan, which commemorated an event homosexuals regarded as a turning point. 25 years earlier, gay men fought back vigorously against a police raid on the Stonewall Bar in Greenwich Village. In the early 90s, gay and lesbian groups campaigned more openly, more determinedly against discrimination, and for more attention to the scourge of AIDS, which they claimed was being given only marginal attention by the national government. And it was. In Rochester, New York, a local campaign achieved an unprecedented decision barring military recruiters from a school district because of the Defense Department discrimination against gay soldiers. The labor movement in the 80s and 90s was considerably weakened by the decline of manufacturing, by the flight of factories to other countries, by the hostility of the Reagan administration and its appointees on the National Labor Relations Board. Yet organizing continued, especially among white-collar workers and low-income people of color. The AFL-CIO put on hundreds of new organizers to work among Latinos, African Americans, and Asian Americans. Rank-and-file workers in old stagnant unions began to rebel. In 1991, the notoriously corrupt leadership of the powerful Teamsters Union was voted out of office by a reform slate. The new leadership immediately became a force in Washington and took the lead in working for independent political coalitions outside the two major parties. But the labor movement as a whole, much diminished, was struggling for survival. Against the overwhelming power of corporate wealth and governmental authority, the spirit of resistance was kept alive in the early 90s, often by small-scale acts of courage and defiance. On the West Coast, a young activist named Keith McHenry and hundreds of others were arrested again and again for distributing free food to poor people without a license. They were part of a program called Food, Not Bombs. More Food, Not Bombs groups sprang up in communities around the country. In 1992, a New York group interested in revising traditional ideas about American history received approval from the New York City Council to put up 30 metal plaques high on lampposts around the city. One of them, placed opposite the Morgan corporate headquarters, identified the famous banker J.P. Morgan as a Civil War draft dodger. In fact, Morgan had avoided the draft and profited in business deals with the government during the war. Another plaque, did I say plague before? Another plaque placed near the stock exchange portrayed a suicide and carried the label "Advantage of an Unregulated Free Market." The general disillusion with government during the Vietnam years and the Watergate scandals, the exposure of anti-democratic actions by the FBI and the CIA led to resignations from government and open criticism by former employees. A number of former CIA officials left the agency and wrote books critical of its activities. John Stockwell, who had headed the CIA operations in Angola, resigned, wrote a book exposing the CIA's activities, and lectured all over the country about his experiences. David McMichael, a historian and former CIA specialist, testified at trials on behalf of people who had protested government policy in Central America. FBI agent Jack Ryan, a 21-year veteran of the Bureau, was fired when he refused to investigate peace groups. He was deprived of his pension and for some time had to live in a shelter for homeless people. Sometimes the war in Vietnam, which had ended in 1975, came back to public attention in the 80s and 90s through people who had been involved in the conflicts of that day. Some of them had since made dramatic turnabouts in their thinking. John Wall, who prosecuted Dr. Benjamin Spock and 4 others in Boston for conspiring to obstruct the draft, showed up at a dinner honoring the defendants in 1994, saying the trial had changed his ideas. Even more striking was the statement by Charles Hutto, a U.S. soldier who had participated in the atrocity known as the My Lai massacre, in which a company of American soldiers shot to death women and children by the hundreds in a tiny Vietnamese village. Interviewed in the 80s, Hutto told a reporter, "I was 19 years old, and I'd always been told to do what the grown-ups told me to do. But now I'll tell my sons, if the government calls, to go, to serve their country, but to use their own judgment at times, to forget about authority, to use their own conscience. I wish somebody had told me that before I went to Vietnam. I didn't know. Now, I don't think there should even be a thing called war, because it messes up a person's mind. It was this legacy of the Vietnam War, the feeling among a great majority of Americans that it was a terrible tragedy, a war that should not have been fought, that plagued the Reagan and Bush administration, which still hoped to extend American power around the world. In 1985, when George Bush was vice president, former Defense Secretary James Schlesinger had warned of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee Vietnam brought a sea change in domestic attitudes, a breakdown in the political consensus behind foreign policy. When Bush became president, he was determined to overcome what came to be called the Vietnam Syndrome, the resistance of the American people to a war desired by the establishment. And so he launched an air war against Iraq in mid-January 1991 with overwhelming force, so the war could be over quickly before there was time for a national anti-war movement to develop. And I do remember people talking about this could be the next Vietnam. I remember it really clearly. The signs of a possible movement were there in the months of the pre-war buildup. On Halloween, 600 students marched through downtown Missoula, Montana, shouting, "Hell no, we won't go." In Shreveport, Louisiana, despite the Shreveport Journal's front page headline, "Poll favors military action," the story was that 42% of the respondents thought the U.S. should initiate force, and 41% said wait and see. The November 11th, 1990 Veterans Parade in Boston was joined by a group called Veterans for Peace, carrying signs, "No more Vietnams," "Bring them home now," and "Oil and blood do not mix. Wage peace." The Boston Globe reported that the protesters were greeted with respectful applause and at some places strong demonstrations of support by onlookers. One of those onlookers, a woman named Mary Bell Dressler, said, "Personally, parades that honor the military are somewhat troublesome to me because the military is about war, and war is troublesome to me." Most Vietnam veterans were supporting military action, but there was a strong dissident minority. In one survey that showed 53% of the veterans polled saying they would gladly serve in the Gulf War, 37% said they would not. Perhaps the most famous Vietnam veteran, Ron Kovich, author of Born on the 4th of July, made a 30-second television speech as Bush moved toward war. In the appeal, broadcast on 200 television stations in 120 cities across the country, he asked all citizens to stand up and speak out against war. How many more Americans coming home in wheelchairs, like me, will it take before we learn? That November of 1990, several months into the Kuwait crisis, college students in St. Paul, Minnesota, demonstrated against war. The local press reported, "It was a full-blown anti-war demonstration with mothers pushing kids in strollers, college professors and grade school teachers carrying signs, peace activists bedecked in peace symbols, and hundreds of students from a dozen schools singing, beating drums, and chanting, 'Hey, hey, ho, ho, we won't fight for Amoco.'" And let's just stop there. Thanks for joining me. I hope you keep coming back. Hit that like and subscribe button, will ya? Hit that notification bell so you get notified each time I make a new video. We'll see you next time.